Chapter 26. Attempt on the Shah's life and its consequences. The 8th Nowruz after the declaration of the Bab, which fell on the 27th day of the month of Jamadiul Aval in the year A.H. 1268, A.D. 1852, found Baha'u'llah still in Iraq, engaged in spreading the teachings and making firm the foundations of the new revelation. Displaying an enthusiasm and ability that recalled his activities in the early days of the movement in Nur and Mazindaran, he continued to devote himself to the task of reviving the energies, of organizing the forces, and of directing the efforts of the Bab's scattered companions. He was the sole light amidst the darkness that encompassed the bewildered disciples who had witnessed on the one hand the cruel martyrdom of their beloved leader, and on the other the tragic fate of their companions. He alone was able to inspire them with the needful courage and fortitude to endure the many afflictions that had been heaped upon them. He alone was capable of preparing them for the burden of the task they were destined to bear, and of inuring them to brave the storm and perils they soon were to face. In the course of the spring of that year, Mirza Taqi Khan, the Amir Nizam, the Grand Vizier of Nasiruddin Shah, who had been guilty of such infamous outrages against the Bab and his companions, met his death in a public bath in Fin, near Kashan, having miserably failed to stay the onrush of the faith he had striven so desperately to crush. His own fame and honor were destined eventually to perish with his death, and not the influence of the life he had sought to extinguish. During the 3 years when he held the post of Grand Vizier of Persia, his ministry was stained with deeds of blackest infamy. What atrocities did not his hands commit, as they were stretched forth to tear down the fabric the Bab had raised? To what treacherous measures did he not resort in his impotent rage in order to sap the vitality of a cause which he feared and hated? The first year of his administration was marked by the ferocious onslaught of the imperial army of Nasiruddin Shah against the defenders of the fort of Tabasi. With what ruthlessness he conducted the campaign of repression against those innocent upholders of the faith of God. What fury and eloquence he displayed in pleading for the extermination of the lives of Qudus, of Mullah Hussein, and of 313 of the best and noblest of his countrymen. The second year of his ministry found him battling with savage determination to extirpate the faith in the capital. It was he who authorized and encouraged the capture of the believers who resided in that city, and who ordered the execution of the 7 martyrs of Tehran. It was he who unchained the offensive against Vahid and his companions, who inspired that campaign of revenge which animated their persecutors, and who instigated them to commit the abominations with which that episode will forever remain associated. That same year witnessed another blow more terrible than any he had hitherto dealt that persecuted community, a blow that brought to a tragic end the life of him who was the source of all the forces he had in vain sought to repress. The last years of that vizier's life will forever remain associated with the most revolting of the vast campaigns which his ingenious mind had devised, the campaign that involved the destruction of the lives of Hujat and of no less than 1,800 of his companions. Such were the distinguishing features of a career that began and ended in a reign of terror such as Persia had seldom seen. He was succeeded by Mirza Akhar Khan-i-Nuri, who endeavored at the very outset of his ministry to effect a reconciliation between the government of which he was the head and Baha'u'llah, whom he regarded as the most capable of the Bab's disciples. He sent him a warm letter requesting him to return to Tehran and expressing his eagerness to meet him. Ere the receipt of that letter, Baha'u'llah had already decided to leave Iraq for Persia. He arrived in the capital in the month of Rajab, and was welcomed by the Grand Vizier's brother, Jafar Quli Khan, who had been specially directed to go forth to meet him. For 1 whole month, Baha'u'llah was the honored guest of the Grand Vizier, who had appointed his brother to act as host on his behalf. So great was the number of notables and dignitaries of the capital who flocked to meet him that he found himself unable to return to his own home. He remained in that house until his departure for Shimiran, and the footnote here says Shimiran or Shimran, sometimes used in the plural Shimranat, is the name applied generally to the villages and mansions situated on the lower slopes descending from Elburz, which serve as summer residences to the wealthier inhabitants. I have heard it stated by Akei Kalim that in the course of that journey Baha'u'llah was able to meet Azim, who had been endeavoring for a long time to see him, and who, in that interview, was advised in the most emphatic terms to abandon the plan he had conceived. Baha'u'llah condemned his designs, dissociated himself entirely from the act it was his intention to commit, and warned him that such an attempt would precipitate fresh disasters of unprecedented magnitude. Baha'u'llah proceeded to Labasan and was staying in the village of Afshi, the property of the Grand Vizier, when the news of the attempt on the life of Naziruddin Shah reached him. Jafar Quli Khan was still acting as his host on behalf of the Amir Nizam. That criminal act was committed towards the end of the month of Shawwal in the year 88-1268, the 28th of Shawwal, the 15th of August, AD 1852. By two obscure and irresponsible young men, one named Sadiq-i Tabrizi and the other Fathullah-i Qumi, both of whom earned their livelihood in Tehran. At a time when the imperial army, headed by the Shah himself, had encamped in Shimiran, these two ignorant youths, in a frenzy of despair, arose to avenge the blood of their slaughtered brethren. The folly that characterized their act was betrayed by the fact that in making such an attempt on the life of their sovereign, instead of employing effective weapons which would ensure the success of their venture, these youths charged their pistols with shot which no reasonable person would ever think of using for such a purpose. Had their action been instigated by a man of judgment and common sense, he would certainly never have allowed them to carry out their intention with such ridiculously ineffective instruments. That act, though committed by wild and feeble-minded fanatics, and in spite of its being from the very first emphatically condemned by no less responsible a person than Baha'u'llah, was the signal for the outbreak of a series of persecutions and massacres of such barbarous ferocity as can be compared only to the atrocities of Mazindaran and Zanjan. The storm to which that act gave rise plunged the whole of Tehran into consternation and distress. It involved the life of the leading companions who had survived the calamities to which their faith had been so cruelly and repeatedly subjected. That storm was still raging when Baha'u'llah, with some of his ablest lieutenants, was plunged into a filthy, dark, and fever-stricken dungeon, whilst chains of such weight as only notorious criminals were condemned to carry were placed upon his neck. For no less than 4 months he bore the burden, and such was the intensity of his suffering that the marks of that cruelty remained imprinted upon his body all the days of his life. So great a menace to their sovereign and to the institutions of his realm stirred the indignation of the entire body of the ecclesiastical order of Persia. To them so bold a deed called for immediate and condign punishment. Measures of unprecedented severity, they clamoured, should be undertaken to stem the tide that was engulfing both the government and the faith of Islam. Despite the restraint which the followers of the Bab had exercised ever since the inception of the faith in every part of the land, despite the repeated charges of the chief disciples to their brethren enjoining them to refrain from acts of violence, to obey their government loyally, and to disclaim any intention of a holy war, their enemies persevered in their deliberate efforts to misrepresent the nature and purpose of that faith to the authorities. Now that an act of such momentous consequences had been committed, what accusations would not these same enemies be prompted to attribute to the cause with which those guilty of the crime had been associated? The moment seemed to have come when they could at least awaken the rulers of the country to the necessity of extirpating as speedily as possible a heresy which seemed to threaten the very foundations of the state. Jafar Quli Khan, who was in Shimiran when the attempt on the Shah's life was made, immediately wrote a letter to Baha'u'llah and acquainted him with what had happened. "The Shah's mother," he wrote, "is aflamed with anger. She is denouncing you openly before the court and people as the would-be murderer of her son. She is also trying to involve Mirza Aga Khan in this affair, and accuses him of being your accomplice." He urged Baha'u'llah to remain for a time concealed in that neighborhood until the passion of the populace had subsided. He dispatched to Afshi an old and experienced messenger, whom he ordered to be at the disposal of his guest, and to hold himself in readiness to accompany him, Baha'u'llah, to whatever place of safety he might desire. Baha'u'llah refused to avail himself of the opportunity Jafar Quli Khan offered him. Ignoring the messenger and rejecting his offer, he rode out the next morning with calm confidence from Lavasan, where he was sojourning, to the headquarters of the imperial army, which was then stationed in Niavaran in the Shimiran district. Arriving at the village of Zarkande, the seat of the Russian legation, which lay at a distance of 1 maidan from Niavaran, he was met by Mirza Majid, his brother-in-law, who acted as secretary to the Russian minister. A footnote here says Prince Dolgoruki, and was invited by him to stay at his home, which adjoined that of his superior. The attendants of Haji Ali Khan, the Haji Bud Dawli, recognized him and went straight away to inform their master, who in turn brought the matter to the attention of the Shah. The news of the arrival of Baha'u'llah greatly surprised the officers of the imperial army. Nasir-ed-Din Shah himself was amazed at the bold and unexpected step which a man who was accused of being the chief instigator of the attempt upon his life had taken. He immediately sent one of his trusted officers to the legation, demanding that the accused be delivered into his hands. The Russian minister refused and requested Baha'u'llah to proceed to the home of Mirza Akar Khan, the Grand Vizier, a place he thought to be the most appropriate under the circumstances. His request was granted, whereupon the minister formally communicated to the Grand Vizier his desire that the utmost care should be exercised to ensure the safety and protection of the trust his government was delivering into his keeping, warning him that he would hold him responsible should he fail to regard his wishes. A footnote here says, "When I was in chains and fetters in the prison of Tar, one of thine ambassadors assisted me. Therefore hath God decreed unto thee a station which none but himself can comprehend. Beware lest thou change this lofty station." From Baha'u'llah's tablet to the Tsar of Russia. Mirza Akar Khan, though he undertook to give the fullest assurances that were required, and received Baha'u'llah with every mark of respect into his home, was, however, too apprehensive for the safety of his own position to accord his guests the treatment he was expected to extend. As Baha'u'llah was leaving the village of Zarkandi, the minister's daughter, who felt greatly distressed at the dangers which beset his, Baha'u'llah's, life, was so overcome with emotion that she was unable to restrain her tears. "Of what use," she was heard expostulating with her father, "is the authority with which you have been invested if you are powerless to extend your protection to a guest whom you have received in your house?" The minister, who had a great affection for his daughter, was moved by the sight of her tears, and sought to comfort her by his assurances that he would do all in his power to avert the danger that threatened the life of Baha'u'llah. That day the army of Nasir-ed-Din Shah was thrown into a state of violent tumult. The peremptory orders of the sovereign, following so closely upon the attempt on his life, gave rise to the wildest rumors and excited the fiercest passions in the hearts of the people of the neighborhood. The agitation spread to Tehran and fanned into flaming fury the smoldering embers of hatred which the enemies of the cause still nourished in their hearts. Confusion, unprecedented in its range, reigned in the capital. A word of denunciation, a sign or a whisper, was sufficient to subject the innocent to a persecution which no pen dared try to describe. Security of life and property had completely vanished. The highest ecclesiastical authorities in the capital joined hands with the most influential members of the government to deal, what they hoped, would be the fatal blow to a foe who, for 8 years, had so gravely shaken the peace of the land, and whom no cunning or violence had yet been able to silence. A footnote here says, "A letter written by an Austrian officer, Captain von Gumuens, then in the Shah's service, runs as follows. Tehran, August 29th, 1852. Dear friend, my last letter of the 20th inst. Mentioned the attempt on the king. I will now communicate to you the result of the interrogation to which the 2 criminals were subjected. In spite of the terrible tortures inflicted, the examination extorted no comprehensive confession. The lips of the fanatics remained closed even when, by means of red-hot pincers and limb-rending screws, they sought to discover the chief conspirator. But follow me, my friend, you who claim to a heart and European ethics, Follow me to the unhappy ones who, with gouged out eyes, must eat on the scene of the deed without any source their own amputated ears, or whose teeth are torn out with inhuman violence by the hand of the executioner, or whose bare skulls are simply crushed by blows from a hammer, or where the bazaar is illuminated with unhappy victims, because on right and left the people dig deep holes in their breasts and shoulders, and insert burning wicks in the wounds. I saw some dragged in chains through the bazaar, preceded by a military band, in whom these wicks had burned so deep that now the fat flickered convulsively in the wound like a newly extinguished lamp. Not seldom it happens that the unwearying ingenuity of the Orientals lead to fresh tortures. They will skin the soles of the Babi's feet, soak the wounds in boiling oil, shoe the foot like the hoof of a horse, and compel the victim to run. No cry escaped from the victim's breast. The torment is endured in dark silence by the numbed sensation of the fanatic. Now he must run. The body cannot endure what the soul has endured. He falls. Give him the coup de grace. Put him out of his pain. No, the executioner swings the whip, and I myself have had to witness it. The unhappy victim of hundredfold tortures runs. This is the beginning of the end. As for the end itself, they hang the scorched and perforated bodies by their hands and feet to a tree head downwards, and now every Persian may try his marksmanship to his heart's content from a fixed but not too proximate distance on the noble quarry placed at his disposal. I saw corpses torn by nearly 150 bullets. When I read over again what I have written, I am overcome by the thought that those who are with you in our dearly beloved Austria may doubt the full truth of the picture and accuse me of exaggeration. Would to God that I had not lived to see it. But the duties of my profession, I was unhappily often, only too often, a witness of these abominations. At the present, I never leave my house in order not to meet with fresh scenes of horror. After their death, the Babis are hacked in two and either nailed to the city gate or cast out into the plain as food for the dogs and jackals. Thus the punishment extends even beyond the limits which bound this bitter world, for Mussulmans who are not buried have no right to enter the Prophet's paradise. Since my whole soul revolts against such infamy, against such abominations as recent times, according to the judgment of all present, I will no longer maintain my connection with the scene of such crimes. He goes on to say that he has already asked for his discharge, but has not yet received an answer. From E.G. Brown's Materials for the Study of the Babi Religion, pages 267 to 271. Baha'u'llah, now that the Bab was no more, appeared in their eyes to be the arch-foe, whom they deemed it their first duty to seize and imprison. To them he was the reincarnation of the spirit the Bab had so powerfully manifested, the spirit through which he had been able to accomplish so complete a transformation in the lives and habits of his countrymen. The precautions the Russian minister had taken, and the warning he had uttered, failed to stay the hand that had been outstretched with such determination against that precious life. From Shiraz to Tehran, Baha'u'llah was several times stripped of his garments, and was overwhelmed with abuse and ridicule. On foot and exposed to the fierce rays of the midsummer sun, he was compelled to cover, barefooted and bareheaded, the whole distance from Shiraz to the dungeon already referred to. All along the route he was pelted and vilified by the crowds whom his enemies had succeeded in convincing that he was the sworn enemy of their sovereign and the wrecker of his realm. Words fail me to portray the horror of the treatment which was meted out to him as he was being taken to the Seershal of Tehran. And a footnote here says of the Seershal, name of the dungeon meaning black pit. As he was approaching that dungeon, an old and decrepit woman was seen to emerge from the midst of the crowd with a stone in her hand, eager to cast it at the face of Baha'u'llah. Her eyes glowed with a determination and fanaticism of which few women of her age were capable. Her whole frame shook with rage as she stepped forward and raised her hand to hurl her missile at him. "By the Sayyidush Shuhada, I adjure you," she pleaded, as she ran to overtake those into whose hands Baha'u'llah had been delivered, "give me a chance to fling my stone into his face." Suffer not this woman to be disappointed, were Baha'u'llah's words to his guards as he saw her hastening behind him. Deny her not what she regards as a meritorious act in the sight of God. A footnote here says, of Sayyidush Shuhada, the Imam Hussein. The Sea Shal, into which Baha'u'llah was thrown, originally a reservoir of water for one of the public baths at Tehran, was a subterranean dungeon in which criminals of the worst type were wont to be confined. The darkness, the filth, and the character of the prisoners combined to make of that pestilential dungeon the most abominable place to which human beings could be condemned. His feet were placed in stocks, and around his neck were fastened the Kara Guha chains, infamous throughout Persia for their galling weight, and a footnote here says, "If sometime thou shouldst happen to visit the prison of His Majesty the Shah, ask thou the director and chief of that place to show thee those two chains, one of which is known as Kara Guha, and the other as Salasil. I swear by the day star of justice that during 4 months I was weighted and tormented by one of these chains. The sorrow of Jacob paleth before my sorrow, and all the afflictions of Job were but a part of my calamities." From the Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, page 57. For 3 days and 3 nights, no manner of food or drink was given to Baha'u'llah. Rest and sleep were both impossible to him. The place was infested with vermin, and the stench of that gloomy abode was enough to crush the very spirits of those who were condemned to suffer its horrors. Such were the conditions under which he was held down, that even one of the executioners, who were watching over him, was moved with pity. Several times this man attempted to induce Baha'u'llah to take some tea, which he had managed to introduce into the dungeon under the cover of his garments. Baha'u'llah, however, would refuse to drink it. His family often endeavored to persuade the guards to allow them to carry the food they had prepared for him into his prison. Though at first no amount of pleading would induce the guards to relax the severity of their discipline, yet gradually they yielded to his friend's importunity. No one could be sure, however, whether that food would eventually reach him, or whether he would consent to eat it, whilst a number of his fellow prisoners were starving before his eyes. Surely greater misery than had befallen these innocent victims of the wrath of their sovereign could hardly be imagined. A footnote here says, "We had nothing to do with this odious deed, and our innocence was indisputably proved before the tribunals. Nevertheless, they arrested us and brought us to the prison in Tehran from Neavaran, which was then the seat of the royal residence, on foot, in chains, and with bare head and feet, for a brutal fellow who was accompanying us on horseback snatched the hat from our head, and many executioners and farashes hurried us along with great speed, and put us for 4 months in a place the like of which has not been seen. In reality, a dark and narrow cell were far better than the place where this wronged one and his companion were confined. When we entered the prison on arrival, they conducted us along a dismal corridor, and thence we descended 3 steep stairs to the dungeon appointed for us. The place was dark, and its inmates numbered nearly 150, thieves, assassins, and highway robbers. Holding such a crowd as this, it had yet no outlet but the passage through which we entered. The pen fails to describe this place and its putrid stench. Most of the company had neither clothes to wear nor mat to lie on. God knows what we endured in that gloomy and loathsome place. By day and by night, in this prison, we reflected on the condition of the Babis and their doings and affairs, wondering how, notwithstanding the greatness of soul and nobility and intelligence, they could be capable of such a deed as this audacious attempt on the life of the sovereign. Then did this wronged one determine that, on leaving this prison, he would arise with the utmost endeavour for the regeneration of these souls. One night, in a dream, this all-glorious word was heard from all sides, "Verily we will aid thee to triumph by thyself and by thy pen. Grieve not for that which hath befallen thee, and have no fear. Truly thou art of them that are secure. Ere long shall the Lord send forth and reveal the treasures of the earth, men who shall give thee the victory by thyself and by thy name, wherewith the Lord hath revived the hearts of them that know. Baha'u'llah's reference to the seer child in the Epistle to the Son of the Wolf. Abdul-Baha, writes Dr. J.E. Esselmont, tells one day how he was allowed to enter the prison yard to see his beloved father when he came out for his daily exercise. Baha'u'llah was terribly altered, so ill he could hardly walk, his hair and beard unkempt, his neck galled and swollen from the pressure of a heavy steel collar, his body bent by the weight of his chains, and the sight made a never-to-be-forgotten impression on the mind of the sensitive boy. From Baha'u'llah and the New Era, page 61. As to the youth Sadiq-i Tabrizi, the fate he suffered was as cruel as it was humiliating. He was seized at the moment he was rushing towards the Shah, whom he had thrown from his horse, hoping to strike him with a sword he held in his hand. The Shatir Bashi, together with the Mustawfiul Mamalik's attendants, fell upon him, and without attempting to learn who he was, slew him on the spot. Wishing to allay the excitement of the populace, they hewed his body into two halves, each of which they suspended to the public gaze at the entrance of the gates of Shimeran and Shah Abdul Azim. His two other companions, Fathullah-i Hakak-i Kumi and Haji Qasimi Nerizi, who had succeeded in inflicting only slight wounds on the Shah, were subjected to inhuman treatment, to which they ultimately owed their death. Fathullah, though suffering unspeakable cruelties, obstinately refused to answer the questions they asked him. The silence he maintained in the face of manifold tortures induced his persecutors to believe that he was devoid of the power of speech. Exasperated by the failure of their efforts, they poured molten lead down his throat, an act which brought his sufferings to an end. His comrade, Haji Qazim, was treated with a savagery still more revolting. On the very day Haji Suleiman Khan was being subjected to that terrible ordeal, this poor wretch was receiving similar treatment at the hands of his persecutors in Shimeran. He was stripped of his clothes, lighted candles were thrust into holes driven into his flesh, and he was thus paraded before the eyes of a multitude who yelled at and cursed him. The spirit of revenge that animated those into whose hands he was delivered seemed insatiable. Day after day, fresh victims were forced to expiate with their blood a crime which they had never committed, and of the circumstances of which they were wholly ignorant. Every ingenious device that the torture-mongers of Tehran could employ was applied with merciless severity to the bodies of these unfortunate ones, who were neither brought to trial nor questioned, and whose right to plead and prove their innocence was entirely ignored. Each of those days of terror witnessed the martyrdom of two companions of the Bab, one of whom was slain in Tehran, whilst the other met his fate in Shimeran. Both were subjected to the same manner of torture, both were handed over to the public to wreak their vengeance upon them. Those arrested were distributed among the various classes of people, whose messengers would visit the dungeon each day and claim their victim. Conducting him to the scene of his death, they would give the signal for a general attack upon him, whereupon men and women would close upon their prey, tear his body to pieces, and so mutilate it that no trace of its original form would remain. Such ruthlessness amazed even the most brutal of the executioners, whose hands, however much accustomed to human slaughter, had never perpetrated the atrocities of which those people had proved themselves capable. Of all the tortures which an insatiable enemy inflicted upon his victims, none was more revolting in its character than that which characterized the death of Haji Suleiman Khan. He was the son of Yahya Khan, one of the officers in the service of the Naibuz Sultani, who was the father of Muhammad Shah. He retained that same position in the early days of the reign of Muhammad Shah. Haji Suleiman Khan showed from his earliest years a marked disinclination to rank and office. Ever since the day of his acceptance of the cause of the Bab, the petty pursuits in which the people around him were immersed excited his pity and contempt. The vanity of their ambitions had been abundantly demonstrated in his eyes. In his early youth he felt a longing to escape from the turmoil of the capital and to seek refuge in the holy city of Karbala. There he met Seyyid Qazim, and grew to be one of his most ardent supporters. His sincere piety, his frugality and love of seclusion were among the chief traits of his character. He tarried in Karbala until the day when the call from Shiraz reached him through Mullah Yusuf-i Ardebili and Mullah Mihdi-i Kui, both of whom were among his best-known friends. He enthusiastically embraced the message of the Bab. He had intended, upon his return from Karbala to Tehran, to join the defenders of the fort of Tabarsi, but arrived too late to achieve his purpose. He remained in the capital and continued to wear the kind of dress he had adopted in Karbala. The small turban he wore and the white tunic, which his black abba concealed, were displeasing to the Amir Nizam, who induced him to discard these garments and to clothe himself instead in a military uniform. He was made to wear the kula, a headdress that was thought to be more in accordance with the rank his father held. Though the Amir insisted that he should accept a position in the service of the government, he obstinately refused to comply with his request. Most of his time was spent in the company of the disciples of the Bab, particularly those of his companions who had survived the struggle of Tabarsi. He surrounded them with a care and kindness truly surprising. He and his father were so influential that the Amir Nizam was induced to spare his life and indeed to refrain from any acts of violence against him. Though he was present in Tehran when the 7 companions of the Bab, with whom he was intimately associated, were martyred, neither the officials of the government nor any of the common people ventured to demand his arrest. Even in Tabriz, whither he had journeyed for the purpose of saving the life of the Bab, not one among the inhabitants of that city dared to lift a finger against him. The Amir Nizam, who was duly informed of all his services to the cause of the Bab, preferred to ignore his acts rather than precipitate a conflict with him and his father. Soon after the martyrdom of a certain Mullah Zainul Abidin-i-Yazdi, a rumour was spread that those whom the government intended to put to death, among whom were Sayyid Hussein, the Bab's amanuensis, and Tahirih, were to be released, and that further persecution of their friends was to be definitely abandoned. It was reported far and wide that the Amir Nizam, deemed the hour of his death to be approaching, had been seized suddenly with a great fear, and, in an agony of repentance, had exclaimed, "I am haunted by the vision of the Sayyid-i-Bab, whom I have caused to be martyred. I can now see the fearful mistake I have made. I should have restrained the violence of those who pressed me to shed his blood and that of his companions. I now perceive that the interests of the state required it." His successor, Mirza Akar Khan, was similarly inclined in the early days of his administration, and was intending to inaugurate his ministry with a lasting reconciliation between him and the followers of the Bab. He was preparing to undertake that task when the attempt on the life of the Shah shattered his plans and threw the capital into a state of unprecedented confusion. I have heard the most great branch, Abdul-Baha, who in those days was a child of only 8 years of age, recount one of his experiences as he ventured to leave the house in which he was then residing. "We had sought shelter," he told us, "in the house of my uncle, Mirza Ismail. Tehran was in the throes of the wildest excitement. I ventured at times to sally forth from that house and to cross the street on my way to the market. I would hardly cross the threshold and step into the street when boys of my age, who were running about, would crowd around me crying, 'Babi, Babi!' Knowing well the state of excitement into which all the inhabitants of the capital, both young and old, had fallen, I would deliberately ignore their clamour and quietly steal away to my home. One day I happened to be walking alone through the market on the way to my uncle's house. As I was looking behind me, I found a band of little ruffians running fast to overtake me. They were pelting me with stones and shouting menacingly, 'Babi, Babi!' To intimidate them seemed to be the only way to avert the danger with which I was threatened. I turned back and rushed towards them with such determination that they fled away in distress and vanished. I could hear their distant cry, 'The little Babi is fast pursuing us. He will surely overtake and slay us all.' As I was directing my steps towards home, I heard a man shouting at the top of his voice, 'Well done, you brave and fearless child! No one of your age would ever have been able, unaided, to withstand their attack.' From that day onward, I was never again molested by any of the boys of the streets, nor did I hear any offensive word fall from their lips. Among those who, in the midst of the general confusion, were seized and thrown into prison was Haji Suleiman Khan, the circumstances of whose martyrdom I now proceed to relate. The facts I mention have been carefully sifted and verified by me, and I owe them for the most part to Akhe-i Kalim, who was himself in those days in Tehran, and was made to share the terrors and sufferings of his brethren. On the very day of Haji Suleiman Khan's martyrdom, he informed me, I happened to be present with Mirza Abdul Majid at a gathering in Tehran at which a considerable number of the notables and dignitaries of the capital were present. Among them was Haji Mullah Mahmud, the Nizamul Ulama, who requested the Kalantar to describe the actual circumstances of the death of Haji Suleiman Khan. The Kalantar motioned with his finger to Mirza Taqi, the Khadkuda, who, he said, had conducted the victim from the vicinity of the imperial palace to the place of his execution outside the gate of Nur. Mirza Taqi was accordingly requested to relate to those present all that he had seen and heard. I and my assistants, he said, were ordered to purchase 9 candles and to thrust them ourselves into deep holes we were to cut into his flesh. We were instructed to light each one of these candles and to conduct him to the market to the accompaniment of drums and trumpets as far as the place of his execution. There we were ordered to hew his body into 2 halves, each of which we were asked to suspend on either side of the gate of Nur. He himself chose the manner in which he wished to be martyred. Haji Bud Dawle had been commanded by Naziruddin Shah to inquire into the complicity of the accused, and, if assured of his innocence, to induce him to recant. If he submitted, his life was to be spared, and he was to be detained pending the final settlement of his case. In the event of his refusal, he was to be put to death in whatever manner he himself might desire. The investigations of Haji Bud Dawle convinced him of the innocence of Haji Suleiman Khan. The accused, as soon as he had been informed of the instructions of his sovereign, was heard joyously exclaiming, "Never, so long as my lifeblood continues to pulsate in my veins, shall I be willing to recant my faith in my beloved. This world, which the commander of the faithful, the Imam Ali, has likened to carrion, will never allure me from my heart's desire." He was asked to determine the manner in which he wished to die. "Pierce holes in my flesh," was the instant reply, "and in each wound place a candle. Let 9 candles be lighted all over my body, and in this state conduct me through the streets of Tehran. Summon the multitude to witness the glory of my martyrdom, so that the memory of my death may remain imprinted in their hearts, and help them, as they recall the intensity of my tribulation, to recognize the light I have embraced. After I have reached the foot of the gallows and have uttered the last prayer of my earthly life, cleave my body in twain and suspend my limbs on either side of the gate of Tehran, that the multitude passing beneath it may witness to the love which the faith of the Bab has kindled in the hearts of his disciples, and may look upon the proofs of their devotion." Haji Bud Dawle instructed his men to abide by the express wishes of Haji Suleiman Khan, and charged me to conduct him through the market as far as the place of his execution. As they handed the victim the candles they had purchased, and were preparing to thrust the knives into his breast, he made a sudden attempt to seize the weapon from the executioner's trembling hands in order to plunge it in himself into his flesh. "Why fear and hesitate?" he cried as he stretched forth his arms to snatch the knife from his grasp. "Let me myself perform the deed and light the candles." Fearing lest he should attack us, I ordered my men to resist his attempt and bade them tie his hands behind his back. "Let me," he pleaded, "point out with my fingers the places which I wish them to thrust their dagger, for I have no request to make besides this." He asked them to pierce 2 holes in his breast, 2 in his shoulders, 1 in the nape of his neck, and the 4 others in his back. With stoic calm he endured those tortures. Steadfastness glowed in his eyes as he maintained a mysterious and unbroken silence. Neither the howling of the multitude nor the sight of the blood that streamed all over his body could induce him to interrupt that silence. Impassive and serene he remained until all the 9 candles were placed in position and lighted. When all was completed for his march to the scene of his death, he, standing erect as an arrow, and with that same unflinching fortitude gleaming upon his face, stepped forward to lead the concourse that was pressing round him to the place that was to witness the consummation of his martyrdom. Every few steps he would interrupt his march, and, gazing at the bewildered bystanders, would shout, "What greater pomp and pageantry than those which this day accompany my progress to win the crown of glory? Glorified be the Bab, who can kindle such devotion in the breasts of his lovers, and can endow them with a power greater than the might of kings." At times, as if intoxicated with the fervour of that devotion, he would exclaim, "The Abraham of a bygone age," as he prayed God, in the hour of bitter agony, to send down upon him the refreshment for which his soul was crying, heard the voice of the unseen proclaim, "O fire, be thou cold, and to Abraham a safety," from the Quran 21:69. But this Suleiman is crying out from the depths of his ravaged heart, "Lord, Lord, let thy fire burn unceasingly within me, and suffer its flame to consume my being." As his eyes saw the wax flicker in his wounds, he burst forth in an acclamation of frantic delight. "Would that he whose hand has enkindled my soul were here to behold my state! Think me not to be intoxicated with the wine of this earth," he cried to the vast throng who stood aghast at the sight of his behaviour. "It is the love of my beloved that has filled my soul and made me feel endowed with a sovereignty which even kings might envy." I cannot recall the exclamations of joy which fell from his lips as he drew near to his end. All I remember are but a few of the stirring words which, in his moments of exultation, he was moved to cry out to the concourse of spectators. Words fail me to portray the expression of that countenance, or to measure the effect of his words on that multitude. He was still in the bazaar when the blowing of a breeze excited the burning of the candles that were placed upon his breast. As they melted rapidly, their flames reached the level of the wounds into which they had been thrust. We, who were following a few steps behind him, could hear distinctly the sizzling of his flesh. The sight of gore and fire which covered his body instead of silencing his voice appeared to heighten his unquenchable enthusiasm. He could still be heard, this time addressing the flames as they ate into his wounds. "You have lost your sting, O flames, and have been robbed of your power to pain me. Make haste, for from your very tongues of fire I can hear the voice that calls me to my beloved." Pain and suffering seemed to have melted away in the ardour of that enthusiasm. Enveloped by the flames, he walked as a conqueror might have marched to the scene of his victory. He moved through the excited crowd, a blaze of light amidst the gloom that surrounded him. Arriving at the foot of the gallows, he again raised his voice in a last appeal to the multitude of onlookers. "Did not this Suleiman, whom you now see before you, a prey to fire and blood, enjoy until recently all the favours and riches the world can bestow? What could have caused him to renounce this earthly glory, and accept in return such great degradation and suffering?" Prostrating himself in the direction of the shrine of the Imam Jadi Hassan, he murmured certain words in Arabic which I could not understand. "My work is now finished," he cried to the executioner as soon as his prayer was ended. "Come and do yours." He was still alive when his body was hewn into two halves with a hatchet. The praise of his beloved, despite such incredible sufferings, still lingered upon his lips until the last moment of his life. A footnote here says, when they arrested Suleiman Khan and strove, in consideration of his faithful service and loyalty, to induce him, by promises of reward from the king, to abandon the creed which he had adopted, he would not consent, but answered firmly, "His Majesty the King has a right to demand from his servants fidelity, loyalty, and uprightness, but he is not entitled to meddle with their religious convictions." In consequence of this boldness of speech, it was ordered that his body should be pierced with wounds, and that into each of these wounds a lighted candle should be inserted as an example to others. Another victim was similarly treated. In this state, with minstrels and drummers going in advance, they led him through the bazaars, and he meanwhile, with smiling countenance, kept repeating these verses: "Happy he whom love's intoxication so hath overcome, that scarce he knows whether at the feet of the beloved it be head or turban which he throws." Whenever one of the candles fell from his body, he would with his own hand pick it up, light it from the others, and replace it. The executioner, seeing him in such exultation and rapture, said, "If thou art so eager for martyrdom, why dost thou not dance?" Thereat he began to leap and to sing in verses appropriate to his condition. "An ear no longer dulled with ignorance and self-subdued entitles one to dance. Fools dance and caper in the marketplace. Men dance, and while their life-blood flows apace, When self is slain, they clap their hands in glee and dance, because from evil they are free. In such fashion did they lead these two forth through the gate of the Shah Abdul Azim. When they were preparing to saw that brave man asunder, he stretched out his feet without fear or hesitation, while he recited these verses. I hold this body as of little worth. A brave man's spirit scorns its house of earth. Dagger and sword like fragrant basil seem, or flowers to deck death's banquet with their gleam. From the Tahirih, pages 228 to 30. That tragic tale stirred the listeners to the very depths of their souls. The Nizamul Ulama, who was listening intently to all its details, wrung his hands in horror and despair. How strange, how very strange is this cause, he exclaimed. Without adding a further word of comment, he immediately after arose and departed. Those days of unceasing turmoil witnessed the martyrdom of yet another eminent disciple of the Bab. A woman, no less great and heroic than Tahirih herself, was engulfed in the storm that was then raging with undiminished violence throughout the capital. What I now begin to relate regarding the circumstances of her martyrdom has been obtained from trustworthy informants, some of whom were themselves witnesses of the events I am attempting to describe. Her stay in Tehran was marked by many proofs of the warm affection and high esteem in which she was held by the leading women of the capital. She had reached, indeed, in those days, the high water mark of her popularity. The house where she was confined was besieged by her women admirers, who thronged her doors, eager to enter her presence and to seek the benefit of her knowledge. Among these ladies, the wife of Kalantar distinguished herself by the extreme reverence she showed to Tahirih. Acting as her hostess, she introduced into her presence the flower of womanhood in Tehran, served her with extraordinary enthusiasm, and never failed to contribute her share in deepening her influence among her womenfolk. Persons with whom the wife of Kalantar was intimately connected have heard her relate the following. One night, whilst Tahirih was staying in my home, I was summoned to her presence and found her fully adorned, dressed in a gown of snow-white silk. Her room was redolent with the choicest perfume. I expressed to her my surprise at so unusual a sight. I am preparing to meet my beloved, she said, and wish to free you from the cares and anxieties of my imprisonment. I was most startled at first, and wept at the thought of separation from her. Weep not, she sought to reassure me. The time of your lamentation is not yet come. I wish to share with you my last wishes, for the hour when I shall be arrested and condemned to suffer martyrdom is fast approaching. I would request you to allow your son to accompany me to the scene of my death, and to ensure that the guards and executioner into whose hands I shall be delivered will not compel me to divest myself of this attire. It is also my wish that my body be thrown into a pit, and that that pit be filled with earth and stones. 3 days after my death, a woman will come and visit you, to whom you will give this package, which I now deliver into your hands. My last request is that you permit no one henceforth to enter my chamber. From now until the time when I shall be summoned to leave this house, let no one be allowed to disturb my devotions. This day I intend to fast, a fast which I shall not break until I am brought face to face with my beloved. She bade me, with these words, lock the door of her chamber and not open it until the hour of her departure should strike. She also urged me to keep secret the tidings of her death until such time as her enemies should themselves disclose it. The great love I cherished for her in my heart alone enabled me to abide by her instructions. But for the compelling desire I felt to fulfill her wishes, I would never have consented to deprive myself of one moment of her presence. I locked the door of her chamber and retired to my own in a state of uncontrollable sorrow. I lay sleepless and disconsolate upon my bed. The thought of her approaching martyrdom lacerated my soul. Lord, Lord, I prayed in my despair, turn from her, if it be thy wish, the cup which her lips desire to drink. That day and night I several times, unable to contain myself, arose and stole away to the threshold of that room and stood silently at her door, eager to listen to whatever might be falling from her lips. I I was enchanted by the melody of that voice, which intoned the praise of her beloved. I could hardly remain standing upon my feet, so great was my agitation. 4 hours after sunset, I heard a knocking at the door. I hastened immediately to my son, and acquainted him with the wishes of Tahirih. He pledged his word that he would fulfill every instruction that she had given me. It chanced that night that my husband was absent. My son, who opened the door, informed me that the farashis of Aziz Khan-i Sardar were standing at the gate, demanding that Tahirih be immediately delivered into their hands. I was struck with terror by the news, and as I tottered to her door, and with trembling hands unlocked it, found her veiled and prepared to leave her apartment. She was pacing the floor when I entered, and was chanting a litany expressive of both grief and triumph. As soon as she saw me, she approached and kissed me. She placed in my hand the key to her chest, in which she said she had left for me a few trivial things as a remembrance of her stay in my house. "Whenever you open this chest," she said, "and behold the things it contains, you will, I hope, remember me and rejoice in my gladness." With these words she bade me her last farewell, and, accompanied by my son, disappeared from before my eyes. What pangs of anguish I felt that moment, as I beheld her beauteous form gradually fade away in the distance. She mounted the steed which the Sardar had sent for her, and, escorted by my son and a number of attendants, who marched on each side of her, rode out to the garden that was to be the scene of her martyrdom. 3 hours later my son returned, his face drenched with tears, hurling imprecations at the Sardar and his abject lieutenants. I tried to calm his agitation, and, seating him beside me, asked him to relate as fully as he could the circumstances of her death. "Mother," he sobbingly replied, "I can scarcely attempt to describe what my eyes have beheld. We straightway proceeded to the Ilkhani garden outside the gate of the city. There I found, to my horror, the Sardar and his lieutenants absorbed in acts of debauchery and shame, flushed with wine and roaring with laughter. Arriving at the gate, Tahirih dismounted, and, calling me to her, asked me to act as her intermediary with the Sardar, whom she said she was disinclined to address in the midst of his revelry. They apparently wished to strangle me, she said. I set aside, long ago, a silken kerchief, which I hoped would be used for this purpose. I deliver it into your hands, and wish you to induce that dissolute drunkard to use it as a means whereby he can take my life." When I went to the Sardar, I found him in a state of wretched intoxication. "Interrupt not the gaiety of our festival," I heard him shout as I approached him. "Let that miserable wretch be strangled and the body be thrown into a pit." I was greatly surprised at such an order. Believing it unnecessary to venture any request from him, I went to 2 of his attendants, with whom I was already acquainted, and gave them the kerchief with which Tahirih had entrusted me. They consented to grant her request. That same kerchief was wound round her neck, and was made the instrument of her martyrdom. I hastened immediately afterwards to the gardener, and asked him whether he could suggest a place where I could conceal the body. He directed me, to my great delight, to a well that had been dug recently and left unfinished. With the help of a few others, I lowered her into her grave, and filled the well with earth and stones in the manner she herself had wished. Those who saw her in her last moments were profoundly affected. With downcast eyes and wrapped in silence, they mournfully dispersed, leaving their victim, who had shed so imperishable a lustre upon their country, buried beneath a mass of stones which they with their own hands had heaped upon her. I wept hot tears as my son unfolded to my eyes that tragic tale. I was so overcome with emotion that I fell prostrate and unconscious upon the ground. When I had recovered, I found my son a prey to an agony no less severe than my own. He lay upon his couch, weeping in a passion of devotion. Beholding my plight, he approached and comforted me. "Your tears," he said, "will betray you in the eyes of my father. Considerations of rank and position will no doubt induce him to forsake us and sever whatever ties bind him to this home. He will, if we fail to repress our tears, accuse us before Nasir-ed-Din Shah as victims of the charm of a hateful enemy. He will obtain the sovereign's consent to our death, and will probably with his own hands proceed to slay us. Why should we, who have never embraced that cause, allow ourselves to suffer such a fate at his hands? All we should do is to defend her against those who denounce her as the very negation of chastity and honor. We should ever treasure her love in our hearts, and maintain in the face of a slanderous enemy the integrity of that life. His words allayed my inner agitation. I went to her chest, and with the key she had placed in my hand, opened it. I found a small vial of the choicest perfume, beside which lay a rosary, a coral necklace, and 3 rings mounted with turquoise, cornelian, and ruby stones. As I gazed upon her earthly belongings, I mused over the circumstances of her eventful life, and recalled, with a throb of wonder, her intrepid courage, her zeal, a high sense of duty and unquestioning devotion. I was reminded of her literal attainments, and brooded over the imprisonments, the shame, and the calumny which she had faced with a fortitude such as no other woman in her land could manifest. I pictured to myself that winsome face which now, alas, lay buried beneath a mass of earth and stones. The memory of her passionate eloquence warmed my heart, as I repeated to myself the words that had so often dropped from her lips. The consciousness of the vastness of her knowledge, and her mastery of the sacred scriptures of Islam, flashed through my mind with a suddenness that disconcerted me. Above all, her passionate loyalty to the faith she had embraced, her fervour as she pleaded its cause, the services she rendered it, the woes and tribulations she endured for its sake, the example she had given to its followers, the impetus she had lent to its advancement, the name she carved for herself in the hearts of her fellow countrymen, all these I remembered as I stood beside her chest, wondering what could have induced so great a woman to forsake all the riches and honours with which she had been surrounded, and to identify herself with the cause of an obscure youth from Shiraz. What could have been the secret, I thought to myself, of the power that tore her away from her home and kindred, that sustained her throughout her stormy career, and eventually carried her to her grave? Could that force, I pondered, be of God? Could the hand of the Almighty have guided her destiny and steered her course amidst the perils of her life? On the 3rd day after her martyrdom, August A.D. 1852, the woman whose coming she had promised arrived. I inquired her name, and finding it to be the same as the one Tahirih had told me, delivered into her hands the package with which I had been entrusted. I had never before met that woman, nor did I ever see her again. The name of that immortal woman was Fatimi, a name which her father had bestowed upon her. She was surnamed I Salmi by her family and kindred, who also designated her as Zakiye. She was born in the year A.H. 1233, A.D. 1817 to 18, the very year which witnessed the birth of Baha'u'llah. She was 36 years of age when she suffered martyrdom in Tehran. May future generations be able to present a worthy account of a life which her contemporaries have failed adequately to recognize. May future historians perceive the full measure of her influence and record the unique services this great woman has rendered to her land and its people. May the followers of the faith which she served so well strive to follow her example, recount her deeds, collect her writings, unfold the secret of her talents, and establish her for all time in the memory and affections of the peoples and kindreds of the earth. And a footnote here says, beauty and the female sex also lend their consecration to the new creed, and the heroism of the lovely but ill-fated poetess of Qazvin, Zarin, Taj, Crown of Gold, or Qurrat al-Ain, Solace of the Eyes, who, throwing off the veil, carried the missionary torch far and wide, is one of the most affecting episodes in modern history. From Lord Curzon's Persia and the Persian Question, Volume 1, page 497, Note 2. No memory is more deeply venerated or kindles greater enthusiasm than hers, and the influence which she wielded in her lifetime still inures to her sex. From Valentine Chirol's The Middle Eastern Question, page 124. The appearance of such a woman as Qurrat al-Ain is in any country in any age a rare phenomenon, but in such a country as Persia it is a prodigy, nay, almost a miracle. Alike in virtue of her marvellous beauty, her rare intellectual gifts, her fervid eloquence, her fearless devotion, and her glorious martyrdom, she stands forth incomparable and immortal amidst her countrywomen. Had the Babi religion no other claim to greatness, this was sufficient, that it produced a heroine like Qurrat al-Ain. from A Traveller's Narrative, Note Q, page 309. Almost the most remarkable figure in the whole movement was the poetess Qurrat al-Ain. She was known for her virtues, piety, and learning, and had been finally converted on reading some of the verses and exhortations of the Bab. So strong in her faith did she become that although she was both rich and noble, she gave up wealth, child, name, and position for her master's service, and set herself to proclaim and establish his doctrine. The beauty of her speech was such as to draw guests from a marriage feast rather than listen to the music provided by the host, and her verses were among the most stirring in the Persian language. From Sir Francis Younghusband's The Gleam, page 203. Another distinguished figure among the disciples of the Bab who met his death during the turbulent time that had overwhelmed Tehran was Syed Hussein-i Yazdi, who was the Bab's amanuensis both in Maku and Chirik. Such was his knowledge of the teachings of the faith that the Bab, in a tablet addressed to Mirza Yahya, urged the latter to seek enlightenment from him in whatever might pertain to the sacred writings. A man of standing and experience, in whom the Bab reposed the utmost confidence, and with whom he had been intimately associated, he suffered, after the martyrdom of his master in Tabriz, the agony of a long confinement in the subterranean dungeon of Tehran, which confinement terminated in his martyrdom. To a very great extent, Baha'u'llah helped to allay the hardships from which he suffered. Regularly, every month, Baha'u'llah sent him whatever financial assistance he required. He was praised and admired even by the jailers who watched over him. His long and intimate companionship with the Bab during the last and stormiest days of his life had deepened his understanding and endowed his soul with a power which he was destined to manifest more and more as the days of his earthly life drew near to their close. He lay in the prison, longing for the time when he should be called upon to suffer a death similar to that of his master. Deprived of the privilege of being martyred on the same day as the Bab, a privilege which it had been his supreme desire to attain, he now eagerly awaited the hour when he, in his turn, should drain to the very dregs the cup that had touched his lips. Many a time did the leading officials of Tehran strive to induce him to accept their offer to deliver him from the rigors of his imprisonment, as well as from the prospect of a still more cruel death. He steadfastly refused. Tears flowed unceasingly from his eyes, tears born of his longing to see again that face whose radiance had shone so brightly amidst the darkness of a cruel incarceration in Azerbaijan, and whose glow warmed the chill of its wintry nights. As he mused in the gloom of his prison cell over those blissful days spent in the presence of his master, there came to him one who alone could banish, by the light of his presence, the anguish that had settled upon his soul. His comforter was none other than Baha'u'llah himself. In his company, Syed Hussein was privileged to remain until the hour of his death. The hand of Aziz Khan-i Sardar, which had struck down Tahirih, was the hand that dealt the fatal blow to the Bab's amanuensis and sometime fellow prisoner in Azerbaijan. I need not expatiate upon the circumstances of the death which that murderous Sardar inflicted upon him. Suffice it to say that he too, like those who went before, drank, in circumstances of shameful cruelty, the cup for which he had so long and deeply yearned. I now proceed to relate what befell the remaining companions of the Bab, those who had been privileged to share the horrors of the confinement with Baha'u'llah. From his own lips I have often heard the following account. All those who were struck down by the storm that raged during that memorable year in Tehran were our fellow prisoners in the SHAH'S, where we were confined. We were all huddled together in one cell, our feet in stocks, and around our necks fastened the most galling of chains. The air we breathed was laden with the foulest impurities, while the floor on which we sat was covered with filth and infested with vermin. No ray of light was allowed to penetrate that pestilential dungeon or to warm its icy coldness. We were placed in 2 rows, each facing the other. We had taught them to repeat certain verses which every night they chanted with extreme fervor. God is sufficient unto me, he verily is the all-sufficing, one row would intone, while the other would reply, in him let the trusting trust. The chorus of these gladsome voices would continue to peal out until the early hours of the morning. Their reverberation would fill the dungeon, and, piercing its massive walls, would reach the ears of Nasir-ed-Din Shah, whose palace was not far distant from the place where we were imprisoned. "What means this sound?" he was reported to have exclaimed. "It is the anthem the Babis are intoning in their prison," they replied. The Shah made no further remarks, nor did he attempt to restrain the enthusiasm his prisoners, despite the horrors of their confinement, continued to display. One day there was brought to our prison a tray of roasted meat, which they informed us the Shah had ordered to be distributed amongst the prisoners. "The Shah," we were told, "faithful to a vow he made, has chosen this day to offer to you all this lamb in fulfillment of his pledge." A deep silence fell upon our companions, who expected us to make answer on their behalf. "We return this gift to you," we replied. "We can well dispense with this offer." The answer we made would have greatly irritated the guards had they not been eager to devour the food we had refused to touch. Despite the hunger with which our companions were afflicted, only one among them, a certain Mirza Hussein-i Mutawalli-i Kumi, showed any desire to eat of the food the sovereign had spread before us. With a fortitude that was truly heroic, our fellow prisoners submitted without a murmur to endure the piteous plight to which they were reduced. Praise to God, instead of complaint to the treatment meted out to them by the Shah, fell unceasingly from their lips praise with which they sought to beguile the hardships of a cruel captivity. Every day our jailers, entering our cell, would call the name of one of our companions, bidding him arise and follow them to the foot of the gallows. With what eagerness would the owner of that name respond to that solemn call! Relieved of his chains, he would spring to his feet, and in a state of uncontrollable delight would approach and embrace us. We would seek to comfort him with the assurance of an everlasting life in the world beyond, and filling his heart with hope and joy, would send him forth to win the crown of glory. He would embrace in turn the rest of his fellow prisoners, and then proceed to die as dauntlessly as he had lived. Soon after the martyrdom of each of these companions, we would be informed by the executioner, who had grown to be friendly with us, of the circumstances of the death of his victim, and of the joy with which he had endured his sufferings to the very end. We were awakened one night ere break of day by Mirza Abdul Wahab-i Shirazi, who was bound with us to the same chains. He had left Kazimain and followed us to Tehran, where he was arrested and thrown into prison. He asked us whether we were awake, and proceeded to relate to us his dream. "I have this night," he said, "been soaring into a space of infinite vastness and beauty. I seemed to be uplifted on wings that carried me wherever I desired to go. A feeling of rapturous delight filled my soul. I flew in the midst of that immensity with a swiftness and ease that I cannot describe. Today," we replied, "it will be your turn to sacrifice yourself for this cause. May you remain firm and steadfast to the end. You will then find yourself soaring in that same limitless space of which you dreamed, traversing with the same ease and swiftness the realm of immortal sovereignty, and gazing with that same rapture upon the infinite horizon." That morning saw the jailer again enter our cell and call out the name of Abul Wahab. Throwing off his chains, he sprang to his feet, embraced each one of his fellow prisoners, and taking us into his arms, pressed us lovingly to his heart. That moment we discovered that he had no shoes to wear. We gave him our own, and speaking a last word of encouragement and cheer, sent him forth to the scene of his martyrdom. Later on his executioner came to us, praising in glowing language the spirit which that youth had shown. How thankful we were to God for this testimony which the executioner himself had given. All this suffering and the cruel revenge the authorities had taken on those who had attempted the life of the sovereign failed to appease the anger of the Shah's mother. Day and night she persisted in her vindictive clamour, demanding the execution of Baha'u'llah, whom she still regarded as the real author of the crime. "Deliver him to the executioner," she insistently cried to the authorities. "What greater humiliation than this, that I, who am the mother of the Shah, should be powerless to inflict upon that criminal the punishment so dastardly an act deserves?" A cry for vengeance, which an impotent rage served to intensify, was doomed to remain unanswered. Despite her machinations, Baha'u'llah was saved from the fate she had so importunately striven to precipitate. The prisoner was eventually released from his confinement, and was able to unfold and establish, beyond the confines of the kingdom of her son, a sovereignty, the possibility of which she could never even have dreamed of. The blood shed in the course of that fateful year in Tehran by that heroic band with whom Baha'u'llah had been imprisoned was the ransom paid for his deliverance from the hand of a foe that sought to prevent him from achieving the purpose for which God had destined him. Ever since the time he espoused the cause of the Bab, he had never neglected one single occasion to champion the faith he had embraced. He had exposed himself to the perils which the followers of the faith had to face in its early days. He was the first of the Bab's disciples to set the example of renunciation and service to the cause. Yet his life, beset as it was by the risks and dangers that a career such as his was sure to encounter, was spared by that same Providence who had chosen him for a task which he, in his wisdom, deemed it as yet too soon to proclaim publicly. The terror that convulsed Tehran was but one of the many risks and dangers to which Baha'u'llah's life was exposed. Men, women, and children in the capital trembled at the ruthlessness with which the enemy pursued their victims. A youth named Abbas, a former servant of Haji Suleiman Khan, and fully informed, owing to the wide circle of friends whom his master cultivated, of the names, the number, and the dwelling places of the Bab's disciples, was employed by the enemy as an instrument ready to hand for the prosecution of its designs. He had identified himself with the faith of his master, and regarded himself as one of its zealous supporters. At the outset of the turmoil, he was arrested and compelled to betray all those whom he knew to be associated with the faith. They sought by every manner of reward to induce him to reveal those who were his master's fellow disciples, and warned him that, should he refuse to disclose their names, he would be subjected to inhuman tortures. He pledged his word that he would act according to their wishes, and would inform the assistants of Haji Ali Khan, the Haji Bud Dawli, the Farash Bashi, of their names and abodes. He was taken through the streets of Tehran, and directed to point out everyone he recognized as being a follower of the Bab. A number of people whom he had never met and known were in this manner delivered into the hands of Haji Ali Khan's assistants, people who had never had any connection with the Bab and his cause. These were able to recover their freedom only after having paid a heavy bribe to those who had captured them. Such was the greed of the Haji Bud Dawli's attendants that they specially requested Abbas to salute, as a sign of betrayal, every person who he thought would be willing and able to pay large sums for his deliverance. They would even force him to betray such persons, threatening that his refusal would be fraught with grave danger to his own life. They would frequently promise to give him a share of the money they determined to extort from their victims. This Abbas was taken to the seer Shah and introduced to Baha'u'llah, whom he had met previously on several occasions in the company of his master, in the hope that he would betray him. They promised that the mother of the Shah would amply reward him for such a betrayal. Every time he was taken into Baha'u'llah's presence, Abbas, after standing a few moments before him and gazing upon his face, would leave the place, emphatically denying ever having seen him. Having failed in their effort, they resorted to poison in the hope of obtaining the favor of the mother of their sovereign. They were able to intercept the food that their prisoner, Baha'u'llah, was permitted to receive from his home, and mixed with it the poison they hoped would be fatal to him. This measure, though impairing the health of Baha'u'llah for years, failed to achieve its purpose. The enemy was finally induced to cease regarding him, Baha'u'llah, as the prime mover of that attempt, and decided to transfer the responsibility for this act to Azim, whom they now accused of being the real author of the crime. By this means they endeavored to obtain the favor of the mother of the Shah, a favor they greatly coveted. Haji Ali Khan was only too happy to second their efforts. As he himself had taken no share in imprisoning Baha'u'llah, he seized upon the occasion which offered itself to denounce Azim, whom he had already succeeded in arresting, as the chief and responsible instigator. The Russian minister, who, through one of his agents, was watching the developments of the situation and, keeping in close touch with the condition of Baha'u'llah, addressed through his interpreter a strongly worded message to the Grand Vizier in which he protested against his action, suggesting that a messenger should proceed in the company of one of the government's trusted representatives and of Hajibud Dawli to the Seer Shah, and there ask the newly recognized leader to declare publicly his opinion regarding Baha'u'llah's position. "Whatever that leader may declare," he wrote, "whether in praise or denunciation, I think ought to be immediately recorded and should serve as a basis for the final judgment which should be pronounced in this affair." The Grand Vizier promised the interpreter that he would follow the minister's advice and even appointed a time for the messenger to join the government representative and Hajibud Dawli and proceed with them to the Seer Shah. When Azim was questioned as to whether he regarded Baha'u'llah as the responsible leader of the group that had made the attempt on the Shah's life, he answered, "The leader of this community was none other than the Sayyid-i-Bab, who was slain in Tabriz, and whose martyrdom induced me to arise and avenge his death. I alone conceived this plan and endeavored to execute it. The youth who threw the Shah from his horse was none other than Sadiq-i-Tabrizi, a servitor of a confectioner's shop in Tehran, who had been for 2 years in my service. He was fired with a desire even more burning than my own to avenge the martyrdom of his leader. He acted too hastily, however, and failed to make certain the success of his attempt." The words of his declaration were taken down by both the minister's interpreter and the Grand Vizier's representative, who submitted their records to Mirza Akka Khan. The documents, which were placed in his hands, were chiefly responsible for Baha'u'llah's release from his imprisonment. Azim was accordingly delivered into the hands of the ulamas, who, though themselves anxious to hasten his death, were prevented by the hesitancy of Mirza Abul Qasim, the Imam Jumi of Tehran. Hajibud Dawli, because of the near approach of the month of Muharram, induced the ulamas to assemble on the upper floor of the barracks, where he succeeded in obtaining the presence of the Imam Jumi, who still persisted in his refusal to consent to the death of Azim. He directed that the accused be brought to that place and there await the judgment that was to be pronounced against him. He was roughly conducted through the streets, overwhelmed with ridicule and reviled by the populace. Through a subtle device which the enemy had contrived, they succeeded in obtaining a verdict for death. A Sayyid, armed with a club, rushed at him and smashed his head. His example was followed by the people, who, with sticks, stones, and daggers, fell upon him and mutilated his body. Haji Mirza Jani also was among those who suffered martyrdom in the course of the agitation that followed the attempt on the life of the Shah. Owing to the disinclination of the Grand Vizier to harm him, he was secretly put to death. The conflagration kindled in the capital spread to the adjoining provinces, bringing in its wake devastation and misery to countless innocent people among the subjects of the Shah. It ravaged Mazindaran, the home of Baha'u'llah, and was the signal for acts of violence which were directed mainly against all his possessions in that province. 2 of the Bab's devoted disciples, Muhammad Taqi Khan and Abdul Wahab, both residents of Nur, suffered martyrdom as the result of that turmoil. The enemies of the faith, finding to their disappointment that Baha'u'llah's deliverance from prison was almost assured, sought, by intimidating their sovereign, to involve him, Baha'u'llah, in fresh complications and thus encompass his death. The folly of Mirza Yahya, who, driven by his idle hopes, had sought to secure for himself and the band of his foolish supporters the supremacy which hitherto he had in vain laboured to obtain, served as a further pretext for the enemy to urge the Shah to take drastic measures for the destruction of whatever influence his prisoner still retained in Mazindaran. The alarming reports received by the Shah, who had scarcely recovered from his wounds, stirred in him a terrible thirst for revenge. He summoned the Grand Vizier and reprimanded him for having failed to maintain order and discipline among the people of his own province, who were bound to him by ties of kinship. Disconcerted by the rebuke of his sovereign, he expressed his readiness to fulfill whatever he would direct him to do. He was bidden dispatch immediately to that province several regiments, with strict orders to repress with a ruthless hand the disturbers of the public peace. The Grand Vizier, though fully aware of the exaggerated character of the reports that had been submitted to him, found himself compelled, owing to the Shah's insistence, to order the dispatch of the Shah Sun regiment, headed by Hussein Ali Khan-i-Shah Sun, to the village of Takur in the district of Nur, where the home of Baha'u'llah was situated. He gave the supreme command into the hands of his nephew, Mirza Abu Talib Khan, brother-in-law of Mirza Hassan, who was Baha'u'llah's half-brother. Mirza Akka Khan urged him to exercise the utmost caution and restraint while encamping in that village. Whatever excesses, they urged him, are committed by your men will react unfavorably on the prestige of Mirza Hassan and be the cause of affliction to your own sister. He bade him investigate the nature of these reports and not to encamp more than 3 days in the vicinity of that village. The Grand Vizier afterwards summoned Hussein Ali Khan and exhorted him to conduct himself with the utmost circumspection and wisdom. Mirza Abu Talib, he said, is still young and inexperienced. I have specially chosen him owing to his kinship to Mirza Hassan. I trust that he will, for the sake of his sister, refrain from causing unnecessary injury to the inhabitants of Takur. Being superior to him in age and experience, you must set him a noble example, and impress on him the necessity of serving the interests of both government and people. You must never allow him to undertake any operations without having previously consulted with you. He assured Hussein Ali Khan that he had issued written instructions to the chieftains of that district, calling upon them to come to his assistance whenever required. Mirza Abu Talib Khan, flushed with pride and enthusiasm, forgot the counsels of moderation the Grand Vizier had given him. He refused to be influenced by the pressing appeals of Hussein Ali Khan, who entreated him not to provoke an unnecessary conflict with the people. No sooner had he reached the pass which divided the district of Nur from the adjoining province, which was not far distant from Takur, than he ordered his men to prepare for attack upon the people of the village. Hussein Ali Khan ran to him in despair and begged him to refrain from such an act. "It is for me," Mirza Abu Talib haughtily retorted, "who am your superior, to decide what measures should be taken and in what manner I should serve my sovereign." A sudden attack was launched upon the defenseless people of Takur. Surprised by so unexpected and fierce an onslaught, they appealed to Mirza Hassan, who asked to be introduced into the presence of Mirza Abu Talib, but was refused admittance. "Tell him," was the commander's message, "that I am charged by my sovereign to order a wholesale massacre of the people of this village, to capture its women and confiscate its property. For your sake, however, I am willing to spare such women as take refuge in your house." Mirza Hassan, indignant at this refusal, severely censured him, and, denouncing the action of the Shah, returned to his home. The men of that village had meanwhile left their dwellings and sought refuge in the neighbouring mountains. Their women, abandoned to their fate, betook themselves to the home of Mirza Hassan, whom they implored to protect them from the enemy. The first act of Mirza Abu Talib Khan was directed against the house of Baha'u'llah, which Baha'u'llah had inherited from the Vizier, his father, and of which he was the sole possessor. That house had been royally furnished and was decorated with vessels of inestimable value. He ordered his men to break open all its treasuries and to take away their contents. Such things as he was unable to carry away he ordered to be destroyed. Some were shattered, others were burned. Even the rooms, which were more stately than those of the palaces of Tehran, were disfigured beyond repair. The beams were burned down, and the decorations utterly ruined. He next turned to the houses of the people, which he levelled with the ground, appropriating to himself and his men whatever valuables they contained. The entire village, despoiled and deserted by its men inhabitants, was delivered to the flames. Not able to find any able-bodied men, he ordered that a search be conducted in the neighbouring mountains. Any who were found were to be either shot or captured. All they could lay hands upon were a few aged men and shepherds who had been unable to proceed further afield in their flight from the enemy. They discovered 2 men lying in the distance on the slopes of a mountain beside a running brook. Their weapons, gleaming under the rays of the sun, had betrayed them. Finding them asleep, they shot them both from across the brook which intervened between the assailants and their victims. They recognized them as Abdul Wahab and Muhammad Taqi Khan. The former was shot dead, while the latter was severely wounded. They were carried into the presence of Mirza Abu Talib, who did his best to preserve the life of the victim, whom he wished, owing to his far-famed courage, to take with him to Tehran as a trophy of his victory. His efforts failed, however, for Muhammad Taqi Khan, 2 days later, died from his wounds. A few men they had been able to capture were led in chains to Tehran and thrown into the same underground dungeon where Baha'u'llah had been confined. Among them was Mullah Ali Baba, who, together with a number of his fellow prisoners, perished in that dungeon as a result of the hardships he had endured. The year after, this same Mirza Abu Talib was stricken with plague and taken in a state of wretched misery to Shimiran. Shunned by even his nearest kindred, he lay on his sickbed until this same Mirza Hassan, whom he had so haughtily insulted, offered to tend his sores and bear him company in his days of humiliation and loneliness. He was on the brink of death when the Grand Vizier visited him and found none at his bedside but the one whom he had so rudely treated. That very day that wretched tyrant expired, bitterly disappointed at the failure of all the hopes he had fondly cherished. The commotion that had seized Tehran, the effects of which had been severely felt in Nur and the surrounding district, spread as far as Yazd and Neriz, where a considerable number of the Bab's disciples were seized and inhumanly martyred. The whole of Persia seemed indeed to have felt the shock of that great convulsion. Its tide swept as far as the remotest hamlets of the distant provinces and brought in its wake untold sufferings to the remnants of a persecuted community. Governors, no less than their subordinates, inflamed with greed and revenge, seized the occasion to enrich themselves and obtain the favor of their sovereign. Without mercy, moderation, or shame, they employed any means, however base and lawless, to extort from the innocent the benefits they themselves coveted. Forsaking every principle of justice and decency, they arrested, imprisoned, and tortured whomsoever they suspected of being a Babi, and would hasten to inform Nasir-ed-Din Shah in Tehran of the victories achieved over a detested opponent. In Neriz, the full effects of that turmoil revealed themselves in the treatment accorded by its rulers and people to the followers of the Bab. About 2 months after the attempt on the life of the Shah, a young man named Mirza Ali, whose exceptional courage had earned for him the surname of Ali-i-Sadar, distinguished himself by the extreme solicitude he extended to the survivors of the struggle which ended with the death of Wahid and his supporters. He was often seen in the darkness of night to emerge from his shelter, carrying whatever aid was in his power to the widows and orphans who had suffered from the consequences of that tragedy. To those in need he distributed food and garments with noble generosity, tended their injuries, and comforted them in their sorrow. The sight of the continuous sufferings of these innocent ones stirred the fierce indignation of some of Mirza Ali's companions, who undertook to wreak their vengeance upon Zainul Abidin Khan, who was still dwelling in Neriz, and whom they regarded as the author of their misfortunes. Believing that he had still in his heart a desire to subject them to even further afflictions, they determined to take his life. They surprised him in the public bath, where they succeeded in accomplishing their purpose. This led to an upheaval that recalled in its concluding stages the horror of the butcheries of Zanjan. Zainul Abidin Khan's widow pressed Mirza Naim, who held the reins of authority in his grasp and was then residing in Shiraz, to avenge the blood of her husband, promising that she would in return bestow all her jewels upon him and would transfer to his name whatever he might desire of her possessions. Through treachery, the authorities succeeded in capturing a considerable number of the Bab's followers, many of whom were savagely beaten. All were thrown into prison pending the receipt of instructions from Tehran. The Grand Vizier submitted the list of names he had received, together with the report that accompanied it, to the Shah, who expressed his extreme satisfaction at the success that had attended the efforts of his representative in Shiraz, and whom he amply rewarded for his signal service. He asked that all those who were captured be brought to the capital. I shall not attempt to record the various circumstances that led to the carnage which marked the termination of that episode. I would refer my readers to the graphic and detailed account which Mirza Shafi-i-Nerizi has written in a separate booklet, in which he refers with accuracy and force to every detail of that moving event. Suffice it to say that no less than 180 of the Bab's valiant disciples suffered martyrdom. A like number were wounded and, though incapacitated by their injuries, were ordered to leave for Tehran. Only 28 persons among them survived the hardships of the journey to the capital. Of these 28, 15 were taken to the gallows on the very day of their arrival. The rest were thrown into prison and made to suffer for 2 years the most horrible atrocities. Though eventually released, many of them perished on the way to their homes, exhausted by the trials of a long and cruel captivity. A large number of their fellow disciples were slain in Shiraz by order of Tahmasp Mirza. The heads of 200 of these victims were placed on bayonets and carried triumphantly by their oppressors to Abadi, a village in Fars. They were intending to take them to Tehran when a royal messenger commanded them to abandon their project, whereupon they decided to bury the heads in that village. As for the women, who were 600 in number, half of them were released in Shiraz, while the rest were carried, each two being forced to ride together on an unsaddled horse, to Shiraz, where, after being submitted to severe tortures, they were abandoned to their fate. Many perished on their way to that city. Many yielded up their lives to the afflictions they were made to endure ere they recovered their freedom. My pen shrinks in horror in attempting to describe what befell those valiant men and women who were made to suffer so severely for their faith. The wanton barbarity that characterized the treatment meted out to them reached the lowest depths of infamy in the concluding stages of that lamentable episode. What I have attempted to recount of the horrors of the siege of Zanjan, of the indignities heaped upon Hujat and his supporters, pales before the glaring ferocity of the atrocities perpetrated a few years later in Shiraz and Shiraz. A pen abler than mine to describe in all their tragic details these unspeakable savageries will, I trust, be found to place on record a tale which, however grim its features, must ever remain as one of the noblest evidences of the faith which the cause of the Bab was able to inspire in his followers. The confession of Azim freed Baha'u'llah from the danger to which his life had been exposed. The circumstances of the death of him who had declared himself the chief instigator of that crime served to abate the wrath with which an enraged populace clamoured for the immediate punishment of so daring an attempt. The cries of rage and vengeance, the appeals for immediate retribution which had hitherto been focused on Baha'u'llah, were now diverted from him. The ferocity of those clamant denunciations was by degrees much allayed. The conviction grew firmer in the minds of the responsible authorities in Tehran that Baha'u'llah, hitherto regarded as the arch-foe of Nasir-ed-Din Shah, was by no means involved in any conspiracy against the sovereign's life. Mirza Akka Khan was therefore encouraged to send his trusted representative, a man named Haji Ali, to the Seer Shah and to present the order for his release to the prisoner. Upon his arrival, the sight which the emissary beheld filled him with grief and surprise. The spectacle which met his eyes was one he could scarcely believe. He wept as he saw Baha'u'llah chained to a floor which was infested with vermin, his neck weighed down by galling chains, his face laden with sorrow, ungroomed and dishevelled, breathing the pestilential atmosphere of the most terrible of dungeons. "Accursed be Mirza Akka Khan," he burst forth as his eyes recognized Baha'u'llah and the gloom that surrounded him. "God knows I had never imagined that you could have been subjected to so humiliating a captivity. I should never have thought that the Grand Vizier could have dared commit so heinous an act." He removed the mantle from his shoulders and presented it to Baha'u'llah, entreating him to wear it when in the presence of the minister and his counselors. Baha'u'llah refused his request, and, wearing the dress of a prisoner, proceeded straightway to the seat of the imperial government. The first word the Grand Vizier was moved to address to his captive was the following: "Had you chosen to take my advice, and had you dissociated yourself from the faith of the Sayyidi Bab, you would never have suffered the pains and indignities that have been heaped upon you." "Had you, in your turn," Baha'u'llah replied, "followed my counsels, the affairs of the government would not have reached so critical a stage." He was immediately reminded of the conversation he had had with Baha'u'llah on the occasion of the Bab's martyrdom. The words, "The flame that has been kindled will blaze forth more fiercely than ever," flashed through the mind of Mirza Akka Khan. "The warning you have uttered," he remarked, "has, alas, been fulfilled. What is it that you advise me now to do?" "Command the governors of the realm," was the instant reply, "to cease shedding the blood of the innocent, to cease plundering their property, to cease dishonoring their women and injuring their children. Let them cease the persecution of the faith of the Bab. Let them abandon the idle hope of wiping out its followers." The same day orders were given through a circular addressed to all the governors of the realm, bidding them to desist from their acts of cruelty and shame. "What you have done is enough," Mirza Akbar Khan wrote them. "Cease arresting and punishing the people. Disturb no longer the peace and tranquility of your countrymen." The Shah's government had been deliberating as to the most effective measures that should be taken to rid the country once and for all of the curse with which it had been afflicted. No sooner had Baha'u'llah recovered his freedom than the decision of the government was handed to him, informing him that within a month of the issuing of this order, he with his family was expected to leave Tehran for a place beyond the confines of Persia. The Russian minister, as soon as he learned of the action which the government contemplated taking, volunteered to take Baha'u'llah under his protection and invited him to go to Russia. He refused the offer and chose instead to leave for Iraq. 9 months after his return from Karbala, on the first day of the month of Rabi'ul Thani in the year AH 1269, 12th of January AD 1853, Baha'u'llah, accompanied by the members of his family, among whom were the most great branch, Abdul-Baha, and Akhe-i-Kalim, Bahia Khanum, the greatest holy leaf, Abdul-Baha's sister, then a child of 7 years of age, also accompanied the exiles, and escorted by a member of the imperial bodyguard and an official representing the Russian legation, set out from Tehran on his journey to Baghdad.